Welcome to All Things AI. My name is Ishan, and in the eighth episode of the All Things AI podcast, we have Titouan Tardivent, the France chapter lead for Encode Justice and a recent graduate of Columbia University. Thank you for being here, and it's an honor to have you here today.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me. It's an honor for me as well.
I'll just start off by asking, how's your day going so far?
Going well. No. Really excited to see what we'll be talking about today, and yeah, just excited to get things going.
So, with that being said, we can get into the first portion of today's interview, which is going to be about AI ethics and regulation. So, I first want to discuss AI ethics and regulation, which I've heard that it's a big interest of yours and even connects to some of your work centered around AI. So, on that note, my first question is, how should society balance the potential impacts of AI with the major ethical concerns that it simultaneously raises?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. That's really what we've been trying to look at Encode Justice, and just I think overall the AI community is really trying to measure these things and see how we'll be able to steer AI in a direction that allows us to have these benefits without necessarily be eroding some of our basic societal principles. For me, I think it's really sort of, if we have to simplify this problem, there are really two scenarios for me. One, if it is handled correctly, then I think AI is a positive sum game where really everyone benefits. Our quality of life as a society as a whole increases. We have changing lifestyles that are hopefully for the better, and I think we can really see radical changes in society where we have improvements. People have more time to do other things than work, and I think we will just be seeing radical changes. But of course, this is only if it's handled correctly. If not, if we're not able to really regulate AI in the best way possible, and we just leave it freely to companies to do what they want, I think we could quickly be headed to a negative sum game where liberty is eroded, democracy is harmed if these technologies are put in the wrong hands, and people are hurt. And so I think the message we're trying to push at Encode Justice is that we really need to remember that we need to place humans at the center of AI regulation and not the technology. And what I mean by this is that humans really need to be there at every step of the way during AI development, during AI deployment, and then after to really make sure that these AI technologies are used correctly. And so, for example, in our recommendations for the G7, we, for example, thought of, for example, doing ethics boards in companies that use AI intensively. And this would ensure that we really have humans at the center of AI regulation at the private level and at the public level. And so we have people, different stakeholders from different backgrounds that really understand the different interests of AI integration. And so we have different populations represented to make sure that as these AI technologies are developed, we understand how we're going to harm different sectors of the population if they're not controlled. And so we can adapt our AI technologies to make sure that this doesn't happen.
And I guess just tying this back into current events, I think might have been around last week, President Biden released like a new briefing on like AI regulation in the United States. So with that being said, do you think that movements like the one led by President Biden and in the United States are gonna see like a spiraling effect in the rest of the world to see them also like other nations taking similar action?
Yeah, I think Biden's executive decision that he put out around AI regulation is a really important step because we saw that the United States were a bit behind compared to other sectors of the world in terms of AI regulation. And so the US taking this big step towards addressing sort of every single problem really that's involved in AI regulation is a very important first step. But I really think that alongside, for example, what the UK released the other day with the Bletchley Declaration, that we need to make sure that we're not just putting out these position papers without necessarily following them up with concrete actions. And so I think the next step that will be really interesting. And hopefully, if the US really takes this first step towards enforcing AI regulation, then it will sort of trickle down to other sectors of the world. But I think the important and the interesting next step will be to see what the US does in order to enforce what they put out with this executive memo.
Yeah. And so I guess in the first question, your answer kind of talked about what could go wrong with AI. And one of the ways I see AI negatively influencing society is through bias and discrimination. Because how I like to look at it is there's going to be two different sides. So like one side where everything goes good and AI can even reduce bias, or the other side where if it goes into the wrong hands, it can enforce it. And this also, I guess, ties a bit into regulation. But my question is, how can we address bias and discrimination in AI algorithms? Because if AI isn't regulated to address these areas, it can worsen the current situation of discrimination and inequality all around society.
No, that's a really great question, and it's one that that's been really looked at in the past couple of years. And one thing I'm a bit afraid of is that today, really an issue we're seeing right now is that governments and really just even the European Union has really been heavily emphasizing the future threats of AI. So regarding AGI, artificial general intelligence, and just future advanced AI models. And we need to make sure that while we're looking at these future threats, we really need to make sure that this isn't done at the expense of the current threats that we've been seeing. And bias and discrimination is a really huge one in AI algorithms. It's one that's been happening since really big data started being used in the early 2010s. There was the Google Photos gorilla scandal in 2015. Where people of color started being identified as gorillas through the Google Photos algorithm. And I think one problem we saw then was that instead of trying to fix this problem, they just removed the gorilla identification. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing is that companies are really not going out of their way to try and reduce discrimination and bias through the data they're using. And I think one of the ways we can try and address this is through transparency disclosures. I think that's one thing that would be really important, and but it's one that's also very easy to get wrong. I think most policy today around AI talks about encouraging transparency, but with really no indication of how this is going to take place in practice. And that's sort of the idea I was saying earlier about these position papers. We don't really know what we're saying, how this will be put out in practice. And so, for example, we see a lot of papers like the G7 one originally that was talking about sort of self-regulated transparency by private entities. And I really think that would be one of the weakest forms of implementation for transparency. On the other hand, I also think that internationally regulated transparency is very complicated because you have different laws in different countries, and sort of mixing that together can be very complicated. But also just pushing companies to be transparent is not enough if we also have no idea what the information they publish actually means. And so one thing we can sort of compare that to is in finance, for example. The companies have mandatory disclosures and they have mandatory yearly audits by independent third parties. And I think we need to have sort of a similar model for AI, that we have independent third parties that are expert on AI systems that are able to audit the data that's disclosed by companies who develop and deploy these systems to ensure that there is some sort of rules that are respected with regards to how data is utilized, and to make sure that this data isn't discriminatory. And I think Stanford put out recently their foundational model transparency index, which was very interesting. And I think that's one of the ways we can make sure that we at least understand how data is being used, and then from then try to mitigate it. And so on that point, obviously the main problem is still the data itself. What we're collecting about people is often done in an unfair way, and then this bias, in the end we're just integrating it in our AI systems when we're training them with this data. And so for me, there are two solutions to this. One that's a bit more complicated, that is systemic. Obviously, we need to make sure that we try and remove this bias from the data. And so we can look at this through government measures to ensure that at the very least steps are being made to reduce the bias of data collection, for example, in the use for criminal use, insurance premium decisions, et cetera, and hiring, to make sure that at the very least, we are looking at how we can reduce the bias that is collected in data and that is harming the chances and the opportunities of minorities in, frankly, almost every step of our daily lives nowadays. And I think another way is through trying to measure and limit the influence of data-based models by making sure we're not too dependent on their outputs. And so when we're computing life-changing decisions, whether it's correctional decisions in the judicial system, or determining insurance premiums for individuals, bank loan approvals, social benefits, etc., we need to make sure that we are not just depending on the results of AI systems and what they output based on different people, in order to ensure that at least we're looking at it from different perspectives, not from just a technological point of view, and that we depend also on a variety of different people with different points of view to try and be as objective as possible in these decisions. And a final point is that it is really important for us not to blame machines for being biased. And we really have to be accountable and realize that the problem is coming from us as humans and as a society, and what we are integrating into these AI systems today.
And so this might be like a far connection to make, but as we were like, I guess, discussing companies in a way, like, is there a way to maximize profits that these companies can have while simultaneously regulating AI to assure that it's safe?
I think that's a really complicated question. I think that's really what we're looking at today in terms of AI regulation. It's how to balance just companies being able to really be profitable, being able to invest in research and development while making sure it's safe. For me, I really think that research and development won't be affected by regulation as much as people say it will be. I really think that regulation will be just used as a way to steer this R&D. And in the end, AI systems really just are going to be so much more productive in every single really sector of the labor market that I think companies will have no problem trying to monetize and profit off of this technology. And as governments, they really need to make sure that this regulation steers R&D in a direction that would be beneficial for society. And so I really think companies have to find a way just to adapt to the regulation, and we really should be placing just human and societal benefits before the possible corporate profits that could be made off of the AI systems in the future.
And so my next question is gonna just talk about the job market and AI and how it can potentially be affected. So obviously there's jobs in AI with AI developers, but there's gonna be a lot of other jobs that'll potentially be wiped out by AI, like telemarketing, for example, something that AI can probably easily do. And I've already seen a few examples of it getting involved in that. So my question is, does AI need to be regulated in order to mitigate the effects of automation that AI might hold on the job industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, one thing is clear is that AI will be radically changing the job market in the next few years. We've seen studies from consulting firms like McKinsey, Bain, et cetera, that have been putting out ridiculous numbers in terms of the percentage of jobs that will be affected by AI. And so I think it is clear nowadays that we can really conclude that AI will be radically changing the labor market. But I think it's this transition and this transformation will be really similar to the things we saw in, for example, the Industrial Revolution for agriculture. And we need to remember that back then, people didn't just become unemployed and never found jobs again. There was a transition that happened, people adapted, and they changed their careers based on what was in demand. Obviously, this is a lot easier said than done, and I've just really overly simplified the issue at hand. But in order, I think, to mitigate the effects of automation and to make sure that there is as smooth a transition as possible, governments really need to be concentrating their efforts on education and to make sure that people who will be the most affected by AI systems will be able to get ahead of the curve and not wait until their skills are made redundant. And so these government policies can come through the form of offering workshops, education programs, and really try and integrate the implications of AI technology in the various educational programs and curriculum. So people really understand how they can adapt their existing skills with the development of AI. And so the simple idea is that AI might not be taking people's jobs, but for sure, people who know how to maximize their use of AI will be replacing those who have no idea what AI is. And we need to make sure that as many people know how to use AI to make sure that this transition with AI systems is made as smooth as possible.
And so the next thing I want to focus on is medical AI, and that's probably the area of AI that I myself would like, I guess, find my interest in. And then, so I was wondering because in medical AI, it's an area that can immensely be like automated if AI were to be, I guess, good enough to do things like surgery. Obviously, that's drawing a far stretch, but what would you say are the key ethical regulatory considerations that we need to make before implementing AI in the medical field?
Yeah, I really think for medicine, it's really a separate issue from everything we've talked about previously. And I think the main complicating factor is that we're not just talking about money, we're not just talking about jobs, we're really talking about human lives. We're talking about people that could die, that could live based on the decisions that are made in the medical field. And so I really think that AI systems are going to really pose key ethical questions in the coming years when we're looking at their use in the medical sector. I personally think that when making medical conclusions and recommendations, we really need to, again, going back to my first point earlier, keep humans at the center. AI systems, when they calculate risks, they include a cost function to really understand what is the cost if the decision that I'm making is wrong. And these decisions can't be 100% right, especially because there's really a lot of uncertainty involved when we're talking about humans as biological systems. And there will always be uncertainty because we still don't understand everything that we know. And it is very unlikely that we will understand 100% of everything that's happening in the human body, and we'll be able to predict everything that will be happening based on what we do. But the thing is that with these cost functions, it is extremely complicated to determine a cost function for a human life. Like, how do you determine the worth of somebody's life in case you recommend a risky surgery or a risky treatment for cancer, but it doesn't go well and the person might pass away? And so I think this is why we'll always have doctors, we'll always have the presence of a human figure, because I think personally, only a human who has to deal with the uncertainty of life, who has to deal with death, and especially the finite aspect of life, can understand the worth, the value of a human life. And they are the only ones that can take these final decisions with regards to, should we proceed with the surgery, should we proceed with this treatment, and sort of measure the risks based on a human life. But I really think in other areas of medicine, AI has a formidable potential. And in the foreseeable future, I really believe that we should be concentrating a lot of the AI efforts in the medical domain, specifically in the one that in which it has the potential of the greatest positive impact, which is for me R&D. We've seen systems like DeepMind's AlphaFold and different Alzheimer detection technologies in the past few months and years that just have really an incredible potential to solve medical diseases we've been struggling to target and solve for decades. And I think the ethical decisions and the ethical risks there are a bit more simple. I mean, there are really almost only benefits to using AI systems in medical R&D, and I really think that there is great potential to see what AI manages to find in terms of solutions in the next few years and decades.
And so lastly, in this category, I just want to talk about, I guess, strides being made in AI in regards to Europe, because I'd like to say I'm more involved in like the United States and their AI developments. So I guess I just want to find more about what's happening throughout the rest of the world. So my question is, what strides are being made in regards to AI ethics, specifically in Europe, and maybe even more specifically in France?
Yeah, of course. In Europe, I mean, obviously we have the European Union, so they're the really main regulatory body that's looking at the different risks and potential regulation for AI. And the main piece of legislation that's being passed and studied at the moment is the EU AI Act. And so the EU AI Act is this really, it's trying to cover everything and all possible applications of AI. And it's doing this through a risk-based approach. So individually looking at different AI technologies and measuring what type of risk is being posed by this technology through a specific classification system where there are 4 different classifications possible. The first one being minimal, limited, high, and then unacceptable. And so with regard to each classification system, there are different things and that are supposed to be submitted based on what classification is given for a specific piece of technology. For example, high risk systems need to provide specific trial data as if you were doing like an FDA style drug approval, and they have to submit an accountability framework and provide really a high degree of transparency. So to make sure that when we're looking at high risk systems, that we have every single piece of information possible to make sure that in the future, in their deployment and their use by consumers in everyday life, there are no risks for them. And so risk, obviously, in this case is with regard to the safety and the security of consumers. And so this EU AI Act at the moment is currently in its finalizing stages. It's been studied for the past 2 or 3 years now. And so really the last few modifications of are being made right now. Some even believe it could be passed as early as the end of this year, though I believe that there will still be some countries that will be trying to modify specific things, for example, in terms of biometric regulation. And so I personally believe there'll be more passed early 2024, probably February or March. But obviously, this act is not without flaws, especially because we're talking about generalizing these rules to Europe. Trying to apply generalized standards for countries that already have their own laws is hard. And especially in a field like copyright infringement for things like generative AI is posing a lot of problems, especially because the EU jurisprudence right now is a bit complicated with regards to that. In Europe, otherwise, outside of the EU, there was the Bletchley Declaration of the United Kingdom that was recently signed, I believe, 2 days ago, 2 or 3 days ago. And so this was signed by 29 different countries, both inside and outside of the EU, but the EU and the US were both involved. And this was an interesting piece of regulation because it covered both short and long-term risks compared to some others, like I mentioned, that were really more looking at future risks of AI systems. But again, I mentioned this earlier, and there's really this issue that we see nowadays is that a lot of what is being developed by countries and government these days is little more than position papers, and with really no clear enforcement mechanisms of how we're going to apply these rules and standards that we're quoting in these papers. But again, it's still a very good step forward that was made by the UK, and it sent so important groundwork for the years to come. In France specifically, of course, we're under EU law, so everything that will be passed in the EU AI Act will be applying to us. And so France is really working hand in hand with the European Commission in the development of the EU AI Act. In France, we have a main regulatory body that looks at everything connected to technology, including AI, which is the CNIL, which would be translated to the National Commission on IT and Liberty. It's very active. It recently formed a panel made up of top French AI researchers in order to look at the various risks regarding AI implementation to really develop France's position in how we'll be looking at different AI issues. And one thing that I really appreciate right now with the French regulation is that it's very open to public consultation. I think we've been seeing that a lot in the EU and even in the US, of course, because at Encode Justice we've been very involved with the US government as well. And so the French government, of course, has also been very open to public and the public's opinion. At the moment, actually, at the French chapter, we're currently preparing recommendations for the CNIL's public consultation on the creation of data sets for the development of AI systems. So that'll be interesting to look at. And this is due on the 16th of November. So you'll be seeing that very soon from our end. But yeah, I think I'm very hopeful for the future of AI policy in France because of this openness to the public. And it'll be really interesting to see in the future how France manages to differentiate themselves once the EU AI Act is in place. But again, that we'll be seeing in the coming months.
And so next, I just want to move into general advice for Gen Z. And so my first question here is, how did you first get interested in AI?
So I got interested in AI. I studied neuroscience at Columbia. I was part of a dual degree, so I did 2 years at Columbia, and I got my bachelor's majoring in neuroscience. And part of my neuroscience degree, I looked a bit at neural networks, and I took a class called Machine Intelligence with an editor from the Nature magazine, which is quite famous in the scientific field. And he was specifically an editor of the machine intelligence section. So I took his class called Machine Intelligence, and it really looked at AI from an ethical and scientific point of view. We read a lot of research papers about AI. We went to some conferences, notably by Yann Lequin, who was at that point giving a conference at NYU. And as I took that class, I really realized that there was a really unique opportunity today to be part of this coming wave of AI technology. And frankly, I didn't want to be left behind. And I think just it's a fascinating field. I mean, as somebody that's interested in the social sciences and in neuroscience and in the human brain, I think that how we're seeing AI technology being developed, sort of replicating human intelligence, it's just a fascinating field. And really to see the developments that have been made in the past few months and years with the ascent of deep learning technologies is really fascinating, and I can't wait to see what's coming in the next few decades.
And so last, I just want to ask, how do students get involved in Encode Justice, or if there's any like upcoming opportunities for, yeah.
Of course. So Encode Justice is really a global network. We have chapters all over the world. We're present in over 50 countries. in almost every state in the US. So if there's a chapter, you can check our website at encodejustice.org. And if you see that there is a chapter in your state or in your country, then you can contact the chapter lead of that chapter, and you can join it. If not, then we are also open to creating new chapters in all areas around the world. So if you are interested in this and AI regulation and ethics is interesting to you, then you can, of course, contact us and you can create one. And you can really be in charge of the activities of your own area. You can contact legislators and try to get them to push legislation for the responsible regulation of AI technologies. Of course, if you'd like to take a more casual approach to following our actions, you can, of course, follow our activities on social media through our different platforms. We really post everything there. You can follow the French chapter at Encode France on Instagram. And of course, you can follow our activities through there.
Well, I think that's about it for today. And thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you so much, Ishan.